Critical events such as natural disasters, emergencies, and wars often lead to protests, riots, and mass migrations in societies. The war in Ukraine has sparked one of the largest mass mutinies in the Russian army in recent history. While mutinies and revolts have been witnessed in the Russian army since the early days of the war, the escalating conflict, increasing failures, and a range of issues are fueling even more rebellion within the Russian military. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin and other officials have not publicly admitted that the army is facing a manpower shortage, the inadequacies within the army have become evident. In fact, the Kremlin's efforts to compensate for this shortage are proof of the growing problems in the Russian military. Let's take a closer look at these issues and how the Kremlin is attempting to address them. On the left bank of the Dnipro River, Vladimir Putin is preparing for a crossing by sending in forces. To this end, 2,000 assault troops and nearly 300 speedboats have been deployed in the Kherson region. However, many senior officers view this planned offensive as a suicide mission. Russian commanders are reluctant to send their troops and equipment into battle, a sentiment echoed on social media as well. Both senior commanders and ordinary soldiers are expressing discontent and saying they do not want to sacrifice their lives for this mission. The Ukrainian Partisan Network, ATSH, reports that they are closely monitoring the situation, noting that preparations for the offensive are intensifying. Commanders are frequently called into emergency meetings, returning late at night, pale and clearly worried. This has led to increased tensions within the troops, where no one fully understands what is happening. Despite the psychological pressure, military leadership continues to set what some soldiers are calling suicide targets, further demoralizing the forces. The soldiers' reactions to these orders have been harsh. Some Russian soldiers, unwilling to fight, have gone so far as to destroy speedboats and damage army property. This is just a glimpse into the chaos unfolding on the southern front. Last week, some Russian troops in the Zaporizhia region, reportedly from the 1440th Motorized Rifle Regiment, refused to advance. They cited the solid and fortified battle lines in the area, stating that advancing would be suicide. Currently, no troops are advancing in that sector, they are merely holding positions and experiencing internal conflict. In response, Russian military leadership plans to deploy new troops to replace the retreating soldiers, replacing them with conscripts. Despite assurances from military and political leaders that conscripts would not be involved in the special military operation, these promises have failed to inspire confidence in the soldiers. Many Russian soldiers now question the leadership's claims and express dissatisfaction with being sent into combat. Some soldiers have refused to comply with orders to participate in the fighting, and they could face consequences such as detention by military police. Dissatisfaction within the Russian army is spreading across the front lines. Soldiers in eastern Ukraine are also expressing frustration. Russian authorities have been sending wounded soldiers back into battle in an attempt to intensify the offensive around the city of Lyman by deploying additional assault units from the 283rd and 488th Motorized Rifle Regiments. However, this move has pushed soldiers to their breaking point. Having already lost combat effectiveness due to Ukrainian offensives, these soldiers have revolted against their leadership, refusing orders and voicing their displeasure at the lack of proper shelter from Ukrainian drone strikes. Despite these signs of disarray within the Russian military, the Kremlin has largely ignored these growing problems. While the leadership remains silent about the mutiny, the situation within the Russian army has become increasingly chaotic. One particularly alarming incident occurred in a Russian unit stationed near the settlement of Novopokrivka, where a soldier shot and killed 10 sleeping comrades before fleeing toward the settlement of Polohi. The reasons behind this attack remain unclear, and a search for the deserter is ongoing. This tragic incident is a clear sign of the deteriorating mental health among Russian soldiers. The devastating effects of the war launched by Vladimir Putin in 2022 are now being felt within his own army. But the impact extends beyond the military. Russia's economy is heading toward collapse, and public faith in Putin and his war is steadily eroding. In the early months of the occupation, the Kremlin's narrative was strong, but now the internal turmoil and widespread discontent within Russia are becoming undeniable. Framing the occupation as a special military operation allowed Russian authorities to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while suppressing dissent. Citizens were bombarded with state propaganda portraying the invasion as a necessary action to protect Russia from Western aggression and to support the pro-Russian Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The government suppressed dissenting voices through repressive laws, punishing those who labeled the conflict as a war with fines and prison sentences. However, as the conflict enters its second year, many Russians are increasingly realizing that the situation is a full-scale war with devastating consequences for both Ukraine and Russia itself. More and more citizens are privately referring to it as a war rather than a special operation, and disillusionment with the official narrative is spreading. This shift marks a significant crack in the Kremlin's carefully constructed information bubble. Conversations among friends, families, and communities reveal a growing realization of the human and economic costs of the conflict, even though many Russians still hesitate to publicize their dissent for fear of state repression. Recent polls indicate a decline in public support for the war, though these results may be skewed by government control over public discourse. A September 2024 poll by the Chronicles Research Project found that 49% of Russians now support ending the conflict with Ukraine through a mutually beneficial peace agreement. This is a significant increase from 39% in 2023. These findings reflect a growing desire among the Russian public to see an end to hostilities, as many no longer see any meaningful purpose behind the ongoing bloodshed. Even more telling is that only 29% of Russians support a new troop mobilization, down from 42% in early 2023. This decline in support for mobilization suggests that even those who were initially swayed by nationalist rhetoric or government propaganda are now questioning the validity of the war. The long and brutal nature of the conflict, combined with economic hardship and international isolation, has left many Russians exhausted and skeptical of the government's intentions. What about the Russian economy? The Moscow Stock Exchange, Russia's leading stock market, experienced a short-lived rally following the surprising victory of President-elect Donald Trump in the United States. On November 6, the index rose more than 2.6%, its strongest one-day rally in a year. The rally came as global equity markets generally performed well following Mr. Trump's victory. Some Russian energy companies that were subject to heavy U.S. sanctions, such as PJSC Gazprom and Novatek, performed even better, with their share prices rising by 3.2% and 4.2% respectively. This positive sentiment was attributed to Mr. Trump's claim that he could negotiate the end of the Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours or resolve it before his inauguration in January 2025. However, aside from the brief surge following the U.S. election, Russia's debt market is in a slump. The yield on the 10-year government bond is trading close to a record high of 16%, though it remains below the short-lived record of 19% seen in March 2022. This current high level reflects growing concerns about persistently rising inflation in the country's real economy. The double-digit yield coincides with the peak reached in 2000 when Vladimir Putin first became president of Russia. This is a level that does not bode well for Russian government borrowing, even though the debt-to-GDP ratio of 15% is extremely low by international standards. More importantly, it raises the specter of 1990s-style uncontrolled inflation, a financial crisis, and a ruble devaluation that could significantly erode the savings of Russian households. The stock market is not performing much better. The Moscow Stock Exchange fell nearly 20% last year, which contrasts sharply with most major international stock indices, which, on average, traded upward at a similar rate over the same period. Russian-listed companies have faced payment difficulties triggered by U.S. secondary sanctions on international banks doing business with Russian resource exporters. These sanctions have exacerbated the challenges for large Russian businesses in obtaining foreign currency for their international operations. The ruble has also taken a hit. The currency weakened sharply in November, requiring more than 100 rubles per US dollar for the first time in more than a year on November 18. Since then, the Russian currency has hovered above the 100 mark against the dollar, reaching a two-year low of 113 on November 27. This forced the central bank's hand, leading to an intervention. The ruble has since recovered slightly but remains well above 100. The recent freefall in the ruble is mainly due to new sanctions imposed by the U.S. Treasury Department on a large number of Russian banks, notably Gazprom Bank, which manages international sales of the country's natural gas. Moreover, the ruble has been pressured by the pessimistic outlook surrounding the Chinese economy, which has ultimately limited prospects for Beijing's import demand for Russian resources. Russia's annual headline inflation rate in October 2024 was 8.5%, which is above the central bank's 4% annual target. However, households are feeling the effects of inflation more sharply due to rising food prices, which have increased by more than 30% year-on-year, partly driven by foreign suppliers halting vegetable shipments to Russia. The central bank's record-high and hawkish base rate policy stance of 21% can only partially keep inflation in check. A rate hike is likely in December, but the question remains, how long will it take for the economy to collapse under the pressure of this high cost of borrowing and other inflationary factors? Over the past few years, despite heavy sanctions, the Russian economy has consistently outperformed expectations. In 2023, full-year GDP growth was 3.6%, accelerating to 5.4% in the first quarter of 2024, and falling to 4.1% in the second quarter. Russia's unemployment rate dropped to record lows, reaching 2.4% in September for the fourth consecutive month, down from 3% a year earlier. This drop can be attributed to strong economic growth and the immigration of around 1 million working-age men from Russia following the Kremlin's surprise military mobilization in 2022. Additionally, another 1 million men have since joined the armed forces to fight in Ukraine. The ensuing labor crisis prompted the central bank to indicate that it may continue to raise borrowing costs, pointing to worsening trends in inflation expectations. This comes as strong demand continues to outstrip the limited availability of goods and services, raising concerns that the economy is overheating. The central bank also noted that the expansionary fiscal policy in 2024 has contributed to inflationary pressures. Various surveys have similarly pointed to capacity constraints due to higher-than-expected growth. Standard & Poor's Russia Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index rose to 50.6 in October 2024, driven by export orders, which increased by the most since January 2008, the peak of the global credit boom. In parallel with this export-led demand growth, employment continued to rise. In the manufacturing sector alone, the number of jobs exceeded 3.5 million. The U.S. State Department has described this sector as the Kremlin's war economy. However, orders increased in October as labor shortages boosted order flows. Meanwhile, business sentiment has improved, supported by planned investments in automation and new product development. On the other hand, output cost inflation rose to a one-year high as manufacturers passed on their higher costs to customers. Input cost inflation climbed to a three-month peak, driven by the falling value of the ruble, higher supplier prices, and higher wage bills. Consumer demand is expected to remain strong due to high labor demand and significantly higher nominal and real wages. In September 2024, retail sales rose by 6.5% year-on-year, following a 5.1% increase in the previous month. This exceeded the growth forecast of 6%. It was the retail sector's 17th consecutive month of expansion and the strongest growth since May 2024. The extent to which Russia's foreign-dependent commodity sector integrates with the fast-growing economies of China and India over the rest of this decade will be crucial to the Kremlin's economic survival or future prosperity. By the end of the decade, China and India are expected to be the world's second and third largest economies, respectively. Such an outcome would likely more than compensate for the economic disruption caused by losing the European Union, Russia's largest trading partner and source of direct investment. Total trade between China and Russia reached a record high of $240 billion in 2023. In the first 10 months of 2024, bilateral trade increased by 4% year-on-year to $203 billion and is on track to surpass the previous year's total. India has benefited significantly from its access to discounted Russian crude oil to power its fast-growing economy. before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, seaborne crude oil trade with Moscow accounted for less than 2% of India's total oil imports. By June 2024, this figure skyrocketed to over 40%. As a result, their overall trade even surpassed India's two-way trade with the EU in the last fiscal year. President Putin and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi agreed to increase bilateral trade from this year's $68 billion to $100 billion by 2030. In this context, export taxes on resources will likely raise much-needed revenue in 2024 to finance the growing defense budget, which currently accounts for 40% of total spending. This is particularly important as energy exports are expected to reach $268 billion in 2024, up from $239 billion in 2023. However, the shortage of working-age labor is emerging as the Kremlin's main Achilles heel. Contrary to the expectations of Western governments hoping their sanctions would lead to recession or a deflationary spiral, buoyant demand in the domestic, private, and state sectors, amid strengthening overseas demand, is pushing the economy to its extreme limits. According to an EBRD report, Russia's growth is projected to slow to 3.6% in 2024 and 1.5% in 2025, primarily constrained by labor shortages. Labor supply has been further limited by nearly 2 million working-age men leaving the labor market to fight in Ukraine. Moreover, the terrorist attack in Moscow earlier this year, carried out by Tajik nationals living in Russia, mostly as migrant workers, prompted the Kremlin to restrict the traditionally abundant supply of cheap labor from the former Soviet republics in Central Asia. The arrival of thousands of North Korean soldiers on the war fronts in Russia's Kursk region to fill ongoing personnel shortages may be just one aspect of a long-term strategy to import labor from alternative sources. This could involve bringing in workers from other so-called friendly Asian countries to alleviate some of their skilled labor requirements. As a result, workers from China, Vietnam, India, and other countries with which Russia has recently established economic and strategic partnerships could be brought in to fill labor market gaps. This policy is particularly evident in new investments by China, India, and Vietnam in factories and plants across the country. However, until the labor shortage in Russia is comprehensively addressed, the risk of economic collapse from rising inflation, already kept in check by perniciously high short-term interest rates, could escalate into a full-fledged economic crisis. In other words, from the crisis in the Russian army to the labor force, things seem to be spiraling out of control in the Russian Federation. In such a chaotic environment, what will the Kremlin's iron fist do next? We wait with curiosity. What do you think about this issue? We would be glad if you share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like the video to support us.